this image right here is a pretty important image. Somebody's got chat. Okay, it's a pretty important image because what it is a history of, very, very bare bones history of England from the time of Henry VIII until the time of the institution of the constitutional monarchy, right? And the reason why that's important is because that covers the entire colonial period in the United States or in North America, okay? And so the reason why we need to have some background in this is because we need to be able to understand what's happening in England so that we can understand what's happening in North America, okay? You guys are all with me? Questions, comments about this? Okay, so now let's just dive in here and we'll start with Henry VIII. Everybody's heard of Henry VIII. What do we know about Henry VIII?
He separated the church, like his church, straight from the Roman Catholic Church, and he basically created the Anglican Church, I believe.
Well, it will eventually become the Anglican Church. Yeah, that's the big thing that he does, but he's also well known for what?
Killing his wives.
Well, he only killed 2 of the 8. Right? So, I think it was 6 or 8. I think it was 6. He killed 2 of the 6, but he didn't kill them all. But anyway, you're right. That's the thing, and that's what most people know, right? The reason why we know him, this actually is not true. This where it says he died of syphilis, that's not true. Okay, so I thought I fixed that, but it's false. It's false news, fake news, right? Fake news. Don't pay attention to that, right? That's actually there was a rumor, and it goes around. Some people still believe it, but it's actually not true. I did some research on it, right? But as I think it was Vin talked about, the main thing he did was he started the English Reformation. Well, what is that? The English Reformation. We've already talked about the Reformation, right? What is the Reformation?
When the church began to reform, but it also allowed the splits of like multiple sects of the church.
Right. Well, when we think about who started the Reformation,
Martin Luther.
Martin Luther. And why did Martin Luther's idea of Reformation cause the church to break? What was the conflict over?
He was dissatisfied with the corruption within the church and just different ways to view religion.
That's part of it. So it was really theological. It was a theological break, a theological disagreement, right? They were disagreeing over theology, okay? But when Henry broke away from the church, this is a few years later, right? 1517 was when Martin Luther posted his theses, and it's not until I think 1530 something when Henry breaks from the church, right? And the reason why he did that wasn't because he disagreed with it theologically, because he was very much on board with the Catholic faith, but he had a disagreement with the Pope. The Pope he had married a woman. Her name was Catherine of Aragon. That's not her name. Her name was Catherine, and she was from Aragon. That's why they call her Catherine of Aragon. And Aragon is part of Spain, so it's part of the Spanish kingdom. And Henry married Catherine of Aragon to cement a kind of an alliance between England and Spain, okay, between the royal houses. The problem was that Catherine was not able to produce a male heir. And then on top of that, Henry was infatuated with another woman named Anne Boleyn, right? And he wanted to have relations with her, but she refused to do it unless he divorced Catherine and married him, right? Well, divorce, as you guys may or may not know, is not something that can happen in the Catholic Church. Catholics have never acknowledged that you could be divorced, but they do allow for what's called annulment. And what would cause an annulment's like a divorce, meaning that what it really means is that the marriage was never valid to begin with, right? And so Henry tried to convince the Pope that his marriage to Catherine was never consummated, and therefore it was never valid, right? And Catherine opposed that, and the Pope ended up siding with Catherine. And the reason why was because Catherine was the niece. No, wait a minute. Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was also Charles I, King of Spain. Same guy, right? But because he was a Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope deferred to him. And that meant that he would not allow Henry to get an annulment, all right? So eventually what ends up happening is that Henry has Parliament pass a law that makes him head of the church in England. And as head of the church in England, then he can ask for an annulment and he can grant it to himself. So he did, right? So the whole thing was engineered to be able to annul his first marriage. The other thing was that once he became head of the church, he was also able to, because at that point then he controlled all the monasteries. And so what he did was he sacked all the monasteries and took all their money, right? Okay, so what we really see then is that Henry's Reformation didn't have really anything to do with reforming the church. It had to do with money and politics, right? You guys see me here? So when I say the English Reformation, that's a very different thing than the Reformation. You guys understand that? I know it's a little confusing because they use the same names for two different things, right? But it is important to remember that. So if we say English Reformation, we're not talking about a theological dispute. We're talking about politics and money. Okay, you guys are with me? Questions, comments? All right. Okay. So he breaks the church, and then he ends up going. Oh, I'm sorry.
Did he end up marrying this other woman, and she couldn't produce an heir as well, right?
No, she was the mother of Elizabeth, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, right? Actually, Catherine was the mother of Mary, and Anne Boleyn was the mother of Elizabeth. And then, and I don't remember who it was. One of the other women had a son named Edward, and we'll talk about that in a second, right? Does that answer your question? It all, all this European stuff is very confusing, right? You think American history is confusing, but anyway, so at any rate, then he goes on, and as I mentioned, he marries 5 more times, right? He has 2 of his wives killed, and one of them dies in childbirth. Okay, and then so then I think there were 2 that survived him. One was Catherine of Aragon, and then also Anne of Cleves, who he was only married to for about a day. But anyway, the point here is that that creates what that really does is it feeds into the conflict that's happening on the continent of Europe at this time. Let's think about now the timeline. What is happening on the rest of Europe at the time we're talking about what's happening in England right now? Remember, the Reformation started in 1517, and the Reformation resulted in what?
Is the wars in the church?
Wars of religion. And what were the wars about?
About which religion was better?
Which religion was right? Okay, so in Europe, they're fighting over, the Protestants are fighting the Catholics fighting the Protestants fighting the Protestants. And in England, we see the same divide now. We have most of the people in England are Catholic, and they want to be Catholic, right? But the king is now no longer Catholic, and he starts to introduce reforms that will turn England into more align it with Calvinism. Okay, which kind of keep in mind it's Protestantism, all right? And eventually, what's going to happen is that most of the people in England will become Protestant, and they will despise Catholicism, right? That comes a little bit later, but it all has to do with this conflict over which is the right religion. Okay, So now, as I mentioned, Edward theoretically ruled, but he never really did rule because he was a boy, and he died very young. And then Henry's first daughter, Mary, from Catherine of Aragon, who was a Catholic, becomes to the throne, and she's very popular because she's Catholic and most of the people are Catholic, and she says, we're going to go back to being Catholic. But at the same time, there's a lot of people now who have decided they want to be Protestant, and so Mary decides to solve the problem by what? What does she do with the Protestants? What do we drink on Sunday morning? Bloody Marys. Why do you think we call them Bloody Mary? This is Bloody Mary, right? And why do we call her bloody?
She has blood on her hands.
Well, yeah, but whose blood is it?
Protestant blood.
Exactly. Anybody who would not return to the Catholic Church was killed. So that's why we call her Bloody Mary, okay? She was still popular, though, and she didn't rule for a very long time because she was very sick. She thought she was pregnant, but in fact, she had a huge tumor in her abdomen, and she died from that. And then her half-sister, Elizabeth, who is a Protestant, comes to the throne, all right? So Elizabeth is now the head of the church, and she says, okay, now we're all Protestant again, right? Okay, but unlike her sister or half-sister, she doesn't force everybody to become Protestant. What she does is she makes, if you're a Catholic, you can no longer participate in public life, right? If you're not actually an Anglican, if you're not bound to the Anglican Church, of which she's the head, you're not able to participate in life. So the people who were not able to participate were dissenters. They're called dissenters, and they were also called Catholics. All right, so the dissenters and the Catholics were excluded from public life, which meant that they couldn't be lawyers, they couldn't be professors, they couldn't serve at court, they couldn't be judges, those sorts of things. They were kind of left out of society. Okay, and that was her idea of toleration. You could believe whatever you wanted to, but unless you believe what I want you to believe, you're outside of society. Another thing that happened during the time of Elizabeth was that the King of Spain, who was Carlos I, but then becomes Felipe II, I think, will try to force England back into the Catholic fold and send in a giant armada to try to conquer England. And that armada will be defeated by Sir Francis Drake, which really starts the decline of the Spanish Empire and the rise of the British Empire. So the British Empire will become the great empire of the world and will remain that until the middle of the 20th century. Elizabeth dies, there's no heir. So another thing we should know, first off, one thing in the United States, one thing in America is named after Mary. Does anybody know what it is? Besides Bloody Marys.
Maryland?
Maryland, exactly, okay, because Maryland was founded by Catholics, which we'll see in maybe next week, all right? Elizabeth was also named after something in America, or excuse me, something in America was named after Elizabeth, which was, does anybody know what Elizabeth was called? What kind of queen she was? The Virgin Queen. The Virgin Queen, because she never got married, right? So she's the Virgin Queen. So what do you think in America was named after her?
Virginia.
Virginia, exactly. Okay, although she probably wasn't a virgin, but anyway, because she had a consort, and that's this guy here, James I, right? He was just James of the House of Stuart before, but now when Elizabeth dies, James becomes the king. He's also the king of Scotland, all right? The thing about James was that he was very, very unpopular in Scotland because he was Catholic and all the people in Scotland were staunchly Presbyterian or Calvinist, right? Reformist, okay? And so he was very unpopular there. And he actually ends up being a pretty unpopular ruler, because by now, much of England has decided they want to be Protestant. They don't really want to be Catholic. There are some still left, but most of them don't want to be Catholic, right? And some of them really hate Catholics, okay? So he ends up being king for quite some time. a couple things we know about him. The one thing that we do know about him was that while he was king, he had the Bible translated into English, and that's where the King James Bible comes from, which I think historically is very interesting because the King James Bible ends up being a very, today most people would think of it as a Protestant Bible, but it was actually commissioned by a Catholic. All right, you guys are with me? Questions, comments about this? That also gives us an idea about the kind of language. If you've ever tried to read the King James Bible, you know that it's almost impossible to understand, right? Because of the language, okay? And that is one of the reasons why you had such a hard time understanding Locke, because the language is very different, okay? Okay, now, James dies and his brother, I think it's his brother, I don't know, I don't know the relations of all these guys. Anyway, Charles comes to the throne. He's also a Catholic, and he has a problem. The problem that he has is not necessarily that he's Catholic, although he's unpopular for that reason, but because he wants to send troops to the continent of Europe to fight to restore Catholicism in these religious wars. All right. So basically, you're going to think about it now. The people are on the side of the Protestants, but the king is on the side of the Catholics, and he wants to send troops to help the Catholics, right? So think about that. Maybe in the United States, if there was a war between Canada and Mexico, right, and the president wanted Mexico to win, but the people wanted Canada to win, right? Then the president sends troops to fight Canada, then people would be very upset, right? Isn't that right? And that's what happened here, okay? One of the things that happens is that Parliament becomes more powerful, and one of the kind of aspects of British law, they have what's called an unwritten constitution, okay? I'm not going to go into it. I don't want to go into it in great detail, but one of the things that comes out of this unwritten constitution is the idea that the king can't raise taxes without the consent of Parliament. Only certain taxes can he raise, right? So there's a kind of an idea that the king can raise taxes for emergencies, like if England was being invaded or something like that. But if he wants to raise taxes to build an army or something like that, he has to get Parliament's permission, right? And so what Charles, when he first became king, was financing his armies with his own money, but he eventually ran out of money. At which point, then he went to Parliament and asked for money to support these armies that he made, and Parliament essentially said, "No, you can't have money for that. You can raise taxes, but you can't raise taxes for that." Okay, and then what happens is that the king goes ahead and raises taxes anyway, using what they call ship taxes or the emergency taxes. At which point then the Parliament denounces the king, and the king then tries to dissolve Parliament, right? He says, okay, you should just go away, right? Because I don't have to listen to you anyway, because I got my right to rule from God. I don't get it from you. You get me here? So now here's the other issue. Remember, the first issue we've been talking about is religion. The second issue we're talking about is, where does the right to rule come from? And the king says his right to rule comes from God. But the Parliament says, no, your right to rule comes from us. So then the real conflict is, who really rules England? Is it the king or is it Parliament, right? And of course, the king says it's me, and the Parliament says, no, it's us. And what ends up happening was that there was a civil war. The Parliament went to war against, the Parliament raised an army, went to war against the armies of the king. And eventually what ends up happening is that the king is defeated, captured, brought to trial before Parliament, and beheaded, right? So I shouldn't laugh. It's not very funny. I'm sure he didn't think it was funny. But the point here, though, is that then England will become ruled by what's called a commonwealth, which is in theory a kind of a republic, but in reality it turns out to be a kind of a religious dictatorship, right? Where Cromwell, the leader Cromwell, tries to enforce puritanical religion on everybody in England, right? Okay, so we're just going to leave it right there for now, and we'll come back to it on a different day.